Welcome back, AP Bio, to our final video on our Ecology and Evolution unit, Chapter 22, Speciation. So let's dive in. So, given enough time and enough change, all the differences we've been talking about through mutation, through genes mixing, through natural selection favoring one or the other, are going to result in an entirely different species. So this is where, when we were talking about phylogenetics and cladistics, those branch points where we break off into two different branches on our tree of life. How do we get to two different species? So first, let's talk about what is a species. So there's four prime concepts used in biology of what defines what a species is. So they're the same species if. In our biological species concept, we say they're the same species if they can mate successfully, produce a viable offspring that can also mate. It's a species. The morphological species concept, this is more when we were talking about like cladograms, do they have the same body features? So some of those characters, derived characters we were talking about. Ecological species concept, if they occupy the same niche, they're the same species, because otherwise one of them would have been driven out. And then our phylogenetic species concept, they're the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor or one branch on a phylogenetic tree. So what are we going to use? Well, for the most part, we're going to follow the biological species concept. If they can mate, create viable offspring, and those offspring can mate, you're a species. So let's look up some of those things that prevent mating that may mean that we've speciated into two different species. First, let's look at post-zygotic barriers. So remember, a zygote is what you have when a sperm and egg fuse together. So you now have something that can develop into offspring. That is a zygote. So post-zygotic barrier means after fertilization. So this is after mating has occurred. So two animals or two plants have tried. So some of those barriers are things like hybrid infertility, reduced viability, or hybrid breakdown. So let's talk about all of these. Hybrid breakdown means fertilization happened, the sperm found the egg, it entered, but then that egg didn't develop into a viable embryo, it wasn't born, or it didn't bear fruit, or however you want to say it. It just didn't work out. It just breaks down. Reduced viability is common in like salamanders, where two different species might mate. They produce an offspring, but it's really frail, it's weak, it's not likely to survive, so not really going to work. And then hybrid infertility, they make a very strong offspring. It comes out, but that offspring is infertile, so it's not going to work. A classic example of this is in the genus Equus. So if we look at horses, donkeys, and zebra are all the same genus, Equus, but they're different species. So their offspring are infertile. So that means they can't reproduce. So like if you take a horse and a zebra, they're going to make a mule. And that mule is great. It's strong, it's tall, it's great for farm work, but it can't have mule babies. It's infertile. So we'd consider them not the same species. Same thing if you pair a zebra and a donkey and make a zonkey. Not going to be fertile offspring. Speaking of zonkies, I know you'd want to see one, not just have it talk to you about it. So there's a cute little zonkey, infertile hybrid. Same thing with a liger, a lion-tiger fusion. Doesn't quite work out. So parents are different species. What about pre-zygotic barriers? What's causing a prevention of mating even occurring? So we've got different types of isolation. So reproductive isolation is where two species can't ever mate, and so they're not going to be the same species, and they're going to eventually separate entirely. So habitat isolation, you live in different places, or maybe you have different food sources. So like some flies, some like one type of food, some like another type of food. And because they intermate, enough generations and time passes that those opportunities to mate never happen, and eventually they're no longer compatible. Behavioral, maybe you have different mating rituals. Birds love mating rituals. Blue-footed boobies, for example, may have a pointing display or a courting dance, And if those mating rituals don't line up, you're not going to want to get with them. Temporal isolation, maybe a different time for mating. So in animals, like being in heat at different times, or with plants, some plants flower early in the season, and that's when they release pollen. Some plants flower later in the season, and so they don't flower at the same time, and it's impossible for their pollen to mix, and they're not going to be the same species. Mechanical isolation, the genitals just don't line up. So again, with flowers, they have different shapes for making sure that only a specific type of pollinator can reach them. And since they're only going to go to the same types of flowers, their different flowers, pollens aren't going to be able to mix. Something about snail sex you might not have known, but the orientation of the snail shell coil will determine if two snails can mate, because if their genitals don't line up, those snails just can't make a snail baby. So there we have 4 examples of isolation that do not allow for mating to be successful. 22.2. So talking more about how one species can radiate out. There's a concept of adaptive radiation where you started with one species and it evolves into many different types of species to occupy many different open niches. This is really common with pioneer species or with invasive species, where all of a sudden there's all these open niches to fill. And so as you fill different niches, you become isolated reproductively and become different species. It's really common in lake cichlids, so we'll be talking about that. So as 2 species become reproductively isolated, there's 2 main types of speciation we're going to talk about. Allopatric, which is due to a physical separation. So like maybe there's a geographic barrier, like a river between cuts a population in half, a mountain range cuts a population in half, and they're not able to mix anymore. Over time, because they're isolated, they never reproduce, enough differences pile up that they're now no longer compatible. Sympatric happens when you're occupying the same area. So I'll explain kind of how that can work, but a lot of that is going to be some of those reproductive isolations we talked about, different behaviors, different times, different food sources. 2 prefixes I want you to be familiar with: allo, meaning different, and sim, meaning together. So sympatric, they're in the same area. Allopatric, different areas. Remember those prefixes because we'll see those again. So gene flow, which we talked about in an earlier video, does prevent speciation because if 2 populations become separated by a barrier, but they're still able to mix, like birds flying over the mountain, probably not going to see speciation occur because enough mixing is occurring between the populations that they're going to stay viable. However, if gene flow is cut off between 2 populations, that's where we're going to start to see that speciation. So how does this happen when there's not something that separates them physically? Well, there's a famous study called the Angelina Jolie Project, which was looking at fish in Africa, specifically cichlid fish in both Nicaragua and Africa. And researchers noticed that in the same lake, there were 2 different species, or multiple different species, some of which had really thin lips and some of which had these lush, full, thick lips. I think the full lips is how it got the name. And so what they found was that they were occupying different niches. There were different food sources. So these were habitat isolation, where some were staying in the higher water, grabbing fish or bugs in the open water, and they didn't need big lips because they just had to come up and get it. The big-lipped fish were living at the bottom of the lake. And so what they were doing was putting those lips on the crevices of the rock and sucking out whatever was living in there to eat. So they were adapting to different food sources, and because they were always hanging out in slightly different areas, even though they're in the same geographical area, the same lake, hanging out in different spots of it, and so they never mated, and that eventually led to that separation. Last thing to talk about is polyploidy. This is a result of mistakes in reproduction, which we'll talk about later, how this happens when we talk about meiosis. But it results in extra sets of genes. So, for example, you're supposed to have 2 chromosomes, but if one of your gametes, like the sperm, has both chromosomes and the egg has 1 chromosome, now you have 3 chromosomes when you're supposed to have 2. Typically in animals, this results in them not being viable. So this was like the hybrid breakdown, not going to become a viable offspring. Certain exceptions to that. But in plants, this is really common. In fact, a lot of the plants you eat are polyploid plants. And so this polyploidy has resulted in different traits because now you're expressing more of a gene. It might make fruits, for example, bigger, giving bigger yields or more desirable for like humans when we're growing crops. But this can create totally new species of plants because they are now genetically distinct. All right, that's it for chapter 22 in speciation. Hope you had a good one.